what really happened in the shadows of the ancient Spartan state. We are not seeking the heroic narrative of Thermopylae, but the quiet, chilling story of how that power was manufactured, generation after generation. Tonight, we journey back through time to uncover the quiet truths that history almost forgot. The moment an infant, as life became not a family blessing, but a state asset, subject to immediate, non-negotiable inspection. This is where the life of the legendary Spartan soldier begins. Long before he can take his first dip in the cold, pragmatic judgment of the elders, the air here in ancient Sparta is sharp, disciplined, and permeated by a chilling sense of absolute state authority. This is not the easygoing, philosophical atmosphere of Athens, but a barrack state where every citizen's life, from conception to death, is meticulously engineered to serve one purpose: the maintenance of the military elite, the homohioi, the equals. To understand this system, you must begin at the very first moment of a Spartan life. Imagine the birth. It is not a purely joyous, private affair. The midwife cuts the cord, cleans the child, and then, before the father can claim him, the baby is taken. The newborn is brought, sometimes within hours of emerging from the womb, to a council of elders known as the Gerousia. Or, more practically, 2 official inspectors appointed by the state. This is where the life or death judgment takes place. A ritual known as the exposure judgment. Though in Sparta, it is far more systematic than simply leaving a child in the wilderness. The elders are not looking at the child's lineage or the father's reputation. They are examining the raw material. They are conducting a physical inspection for any deformity, weakness, or a sign of frailty that might compromise the child's future military utility. The state demands perfection, because every body born into the homohioi class must one day carry a shield and protect the collective. A physically compromised soldier is a liability that Sparta, with its small, elite citizenry and massive enslaved population, cannot afford. This cold, non-negotiable process of state-mandated infanticide for the unfit is a widely accepted historical fact. Plutarch, writing centuries later but drawing on earlier sources, describes the process. If the child was sturdy and well-formed, they were permitted to live. If they were weakly or deformed, the elders would order them to be thrown into the depths of a chasm near Mount Taygetus, a place ironically known as the apotheti, or depositing place. They saw this not as cruelty, but as a pragmatic act of collective survival. Why raise a life that the state could never use, and which would only be a drain on communal resources? It is a brutally logical system that treats human life as a resource to be managed, not a gift to be cherished. If the child passes the inspection, they are allowed to return to their mother, but the conditioning begins immediately. The Spartan nurse is famous throughout the Greek world for her harshness. You will hear tales of how Spartan infants are not swaddled in restrictive cloth. They are left free to move their limbs, encouraging physical strength from the start. They are not coddled with constant feeding or lullabies. They are taught, almost from birth, to tolerate solitude, to endure darkness, and to go without complaint. They are, in essence, being taught the first silent rule of the agoge: endure. This early stage ensures the child's natural instincts for crying or seeking comfort are systematically ignored. The lesser known, or fascinating detail is the use of wine as an early test. Ancient authors tell us that Spartan nurses sometimes bathed their newborns in wine, a rough, popular test. The belief was that a strong, healthy baby would react well and remain robust, while a frail or epileptic child would convulse or immediately turn ill. It was a crude form of triage, a final, almost superstitious check of nature's verdict, underlining how the early stages of life were viewed as a continuous process of elimination and selection. It is a striking image, the future savior of the state, crying in a bath of raw, burning wine. The family environment itself is unusual. Spartan women enjoy a remarkable degree of freedom and respect compared to their counterparts in other Greek cities, but this freedom is tethered to their primary function. To be fit mothers of soldiers, they are athletic, often speaking their minds, and controlling substantial property while their husbands are away at the barracks. Yet, this high status is not for the sake of female liberation. but because a strong mother, psychologically and physically, is deemed essential for forging a strong son. The woman's body is essentially a state asset, a breeding ground for the next generation of shields. This is a chilling irony. A greater degree of female autonomy achieved solely in service of a brutally masculine military agenda. For the first 7 years, the boy belongs to his parents. But even this period is preparation for the inevitable severance. He is taught to be silent, obedient, and respectful of his elders. He is raised with the ever-present understanding that this domesticity is temporary, an interlude before his true life, the life of the state. This entire selective system forces us to confront an open question or debate. Historians still wonder if the system of infant exposure was as widespread and rigidly practiced throughout Spartan history as later accounts claim, or if it was mainly a justification and literary exaggeration used by classical writers to emphasize Sparta's unique, almost inhuman discipline. Was it common, or a powerful piece of state propaganda used to enforce conformity? What is certain is that the threat of state judgment hung over every crib, shaping the psyche of both the parent and the child. Regardless of its exact frequency, the practice establishes the central governing principle of the Spartan system. The individual life has no intrinsic value. It only has value as a component of the collective military machine. The moment the infant is deemed fit for duty, the clock begins ticking toward his 7th birthday. The moment he must trade the warmth of his mother's hearth for the cold, demanding embrace of the state. At the age of 7, the world suddenly shrinks for the Spartan boy. Yet his family expands into an enormous, anonymous collective. This is the moment of mandatory enrollment into the agoge pronounced A-go-gay, the state training system. The separation from his family is not just physical. It is a profound, legislated psychological break designed to rewire his core loyalties. He is not merely moving to a new school. He is being adopted by the state itself, becoming a small, interchangeable part of a vast, disciplined machine. He is taken from the soft comforts of his mother-est home and placed into a barracks with other boys, organized into tightly controlled platoons or packs agile. This is the beginning of his life as a state ward. His father, who's likely still serving in the barracks himself, has little role in his day-to-day upbringing, and his mother is deliberately kept at a distance. The state must become his parent, his sibling, and his sole source of approval. This stage is all about de-individualization. The boys are quickly stripped of their personal identity. The clothing is standardized in minimalist single garment, often Jessica, which they wear year-round, even in the bitter Laconian winter. They are intentionally given insufficient food, not to save money, but as part of the curriculum itself. They are taught through constant exposure that comfort is a weakness, and reliance on anyone outside the pack is a vulnerability. The agoge is a system designed to manufacture absolute obedience to the collective, prioritizing the pack over the parent. The individual's needs, feelings, and familial attachments are systematically eroded and replaced with a single, overriding devotion: the welfare and glory of Sparta. This psychological manipulation, cloaked in the guise of discipline, is the foundation of the Spartan military machine. You are now merely a Spartan. The move into the barracks is abrupt and total. These boys, now paid young boys, 7-12, are immediately exposed to a hierarchical world governed by fear, physical hardship, and the absolute authority of the older boys and their state-appointed overseers. The central lesson taught here is not about strategy or drill, but about endurance. Their daily routine is a monotonous cycle of exercise, rote learning, and exposure to deprivation. They sleep on beds they must make themselves, often nothing more than reeds or rushes they collect from the Eurotas River. This self-reliance in the most basic necessities is crucial. It creates an expectation of hardness and minimal dependency on manufactured comfort, a subtle instruction that the soldier must be able to thrive or at least survive in the most hostile environments. The widely accepted historical fact regarding the agoge is its rigorous system of group discipline and hierarchy. The boys were grouped by age and placed under the command of an older, experienced youth. The iron, aged Shilio Dai Shijo. This older boy had absolute authority, acting as the pack leader, teacher, and disciplinarian, effectively delegating state power to a teenager. This created A intensely hierarchical environment where the lessons of obedience and command were internalized, not just from adults, but from peers. Just a few years older, it's an efficient system. The state barely has to lift a finger. The youth train and discipline themselves. The competition is fierce. The boys are pitted against each other in sports, wrestling, and mock battles, all supervised by the padnomos overseer of boys, a magistrate responsible for the system's entire operation. The constant observation and measurement of physical prowess means that the boys are always performing, always seeking to demonstrate their fitness and dominance. Weakness is not tolerated. It is purged, either physically through harsh treatment or socially through isolation. The lesser known or fascinating detail is the use of public shaming as a primary disciplinary tool. A boy caught shirking a duty, demonstrating cowardice, or failing to endure hardship would not just be flogged. He would be publicly humiliated and sometimes required to sing a song composed about his own disgrace. This shame was a far more potent weapon than physical pain. It struck at the core of the Spartan identity, the collective honor of the pack, ensuring that the boy would endure any pain rather than face the crushing weight of peer disapproval. He learns that the pack's judgment is the only judgment that matters. There is a strange, dark irony in the fact that this system, which demands the boys never complain, never cry, and never show weakness, actually fosters a deep, almost familial loyalty among the members of the same age. Having survived constant hardship together, they forge a bond that is arguably stronger and more enduring than any biological connection. When these boys stand shoulder to shoulder later in the phalanx, their perfect cohesion is not based on strategy, but on this shared history of survival. They fight not for their general, but for the man whose cold feet they shared a reed mat with years ago. This profound severance of the boy from his family leads us to the open question or debate. Historians still wonder about the ultimate psychological cost of the Aggie. While the system demonstrably created fearless, loyal soldiers, did the total destruction of individual emotion and familial love ultimately stifle the intellectual, diplomatic, and innovative spirit necessary for long-term state survival? Did Sparta produce the perfect fighter at the expense of the perfect leader or thinker? The 7-year-old now fully belongs to the pack, and his new masters the older boys, and the state will teach him his next, most critical lesson: how to survive. O to endure, and how to master the arts of deprivation, stealth, and, soon enough, violence. The immersion into the Spartan system now deepens, moving past the psychological break of separation into the sustained reality of hardship. The boys of the age of the packs are entering the most rigorous and unforgiving phase of the paids, stage ages 7 to 12. Their existence is defined by a calculated severity, where brutality is not a mistake in the curriculum, but the curriculum itself. The philosophy governing this period is simple and unyielding. If a boy is hardened by constant low-grade suffering, he will become utterly unshakable when faced with real danger. The state is actively placing them in a state of perpetual, manageable crises against their environment, against scarcity, and against each other. Look at their appearance. Clothing is minimal. The single, thin cloak you are given upon enrollment must serve you for the entire year, regardless of the season. Sandals are forbidden. The boys walk barefoot, forcing their feet to become tough and resilient, ready to traverse any terrain without discomfort. This practice, ironically, becomes a badge of honor, distinguishing them from the soft youth of other Greek city-states. Food is kept deliberately scarce. The rations are meager, composed primarily of simple barley meal and a famously bland broth, known as melazimos, black broth, a concoction of boiled pork, blood, and vinegar. This insufficient diet is one of the most ingenious components of the Aggie, for it serves multiple, calculated purposes. First, it maintains the boys in a state of lean, wiry fitness. Second, and far more importantly, it cultivates resourcefulness and cunning. The boys are actively encouraged to steal food from the communal storehouses or from the surrounding countryside. This is the widely accepted historical fact. Stealing was not punished. Getting caught was. If a boy was caught pilfering, he was mercilessly flogged, not for the theft itself, but for his lack of cunning, skill, and stealth. He was judged to have failed the test of the warrior thief. This policy fostered a competitive environment where ingenuity was the key to survival, honing the very skills a soldier would need on campaign. Scouting, operating behind enemy lines, and living off the land. Imagine the boys creeping through the moonlit barracks, their movements silent, their minds calculating. They are learning to navigate risk, to assess targets, and to manage the crippling anxiety of discovery. This is practical training for the covert operations that will define Spartan rule. There is a touch of dark humor here. The greatest military state in Greece was essentially teaching its future generals how to be expert petty thieves. Discipline is constant and often brutally administered. Corporal punishment is frequent, meted out by the older iron leaders and the supervising magistrate. The whip is used not simply to correct behavior, but to cultivate pain tolerance. The constant threat of the lash conditions the young boy to view physical pain as a momentary inconvenience, rather than a debilitating force. The lesser known, or fascinating detail, is the annual ritual of the diamastagosis. While this ritual, a public flagellation of young men at the altar of Artemis Orthia, reaches its height later in Spartan history. Its origins lie in the need to demonstrate supreme indifference to pain. The boys, often kneeling at the altar, were whipped, sometimes fatally, in a kind of public spectacle, designed to test their endurance. The prize was not glory in battle, but simply surviving the ordeal without crying out, a testament to the state's capacity to transform biological reactions into an act of political will. The boys are also trained in the art of laconic speech. They are allowed to speak only when necessary, and then only in short, concise, and pointed phrases. This is not merely about good manners. It is a tactical necessity. A commander needs to issue a clear, unambiguous order, and a soldier needs to report facts efficiently. Verbosity is seen as a sign of intellectual softness and time-wasting, entirely unbecoming of a man of action. The Spartan wit, so famous in Greek history, often sharp, dry, and brief, is a direct result of this mandatory training in economy of language. The environment actively encourages physical confrontation among the boys. Fights and dominance contests are rarely prevented, but are instead viewed as necessary mechanisms for establishing a natural hierarchy within the pack. This structured violence ensures that only the most aggressive, resilient, and socially dominant boys rise to leadership positions, perpetually refreshing the talent pool. This sustained, intentional cruelty leads us to the open question or debate. Historians still wonder about the extent of institutionalized pederasty within the agoge. While mentorship relationships between older teens, arenas, and younger boys were central to the system, classical sources often describe these bonds as intensely affectionate and sometimes sexual. Was this intimacy which reinforced the intense emotional loyalty to the male military society over the family uniton? Officially tolerated or even encouraged element of the training? Or was it simply a common feature of the broader Greek world that Sparta utilized for its own ends? Regardless, the outcome is clear. By the time the Spartan youth emerges from this phase around the age of 12, he is a creature of discipline, resilience, and ruthlessness. His loyalty is absolute, his body is hardened, and his mind is geared toward immediate, pragmatic action. He has learned to fear the shame of failure far more than he fears pain. He is now ready for the next, even more intense level of conditioning. The Spartan boy, now moving beyond the initial shock of the barracks, enters a new phase where scarcity is weaponized. The deliberate policy of starvation introduced in the previous stage is intensified, becoming the central, defining characteristic of his life between the ages of 12 and 16. This is not merely an endurance test. It is a calculated strategy to hone resourcefulness, stealth, and the absolute self-control necessary for a warrior to operate under duress. Imagine the constant, gnawing feeling of hunger. The state provides only enough melazimos and barley meal to prevent outright collapse, forcing the boys to live in a perpetual, energy-sapping deficit. The goal is to make the acquisition of food an immediate, necessary tactical problem, much like a military objective. The boy who cannot forage or steal successfully is not just hungry. He is displaying a critical flaw in his capacity to survive on the battlefield, where supply lines are icily cut and personal initiative is paramount. The daily routine is a rigorous cycle of athletic wrestling and military maneuvers, all performed on empty stomachs. This forced exertion while hungry trains the body to draw on deep reserves of energy and pushes the will to conquer physical weakness. It instills the lesson that the body is merely a tool, and the mind is the only master. The ability to push past pain and fatigue becomes a source of immense internal pride. This phase refines the art of stealth and reconnaissance, skills that are just as vital to the Spartan system as fighting in the phalanx. A good Spartan soldier must be able to slip silently through the night, observe without being seen, and acquire intelligence or supplies without detection. The penalty for getting caught stealing the brutal flogging acts as a powerful, immediate feedback loop, refining movement and judgment with painful efficiency. It is a crude but effective system for turning fear into competence. The widely accepted historical fact regarding this stage is the Spartan emphasis on skills over traditional academic learning. While literacy was taught, as we will see, the primary education involved practical disciplines like tracking, camping, self-defense, and especially the procurement of food. The boys were often sent out into the wilderness of Laconia for extended periods with minimal gear, entirely dependent on their own wits and the cooperation of their pack. They were, in effect, learning to be self-sufficient special forces operatives. The Aggie used this period of intense hardship to reinforce the deep bonds within the eight. While competition was fierce, stealing was generally directed outward toward the state's storehouses or the non-Spartan settlements. Stealing from a fellow pack member was a betrayal of the collective and likely met with severe punishment, fostering a sharp distinction between the necessary ruthlessness required against the external world and the absolute loyalty demanded within the group. The rule is, we starve together, or we steal successfully together. The lesser known or fascinating detail is the strange, almost ritualistic simplicity of their beds. As they advance in age, the boys are often instructed to sleep without blankets, sometimes merely on dry rushes pulled from the Eurotas River. In the winter, they would knead these reeds until the tips were worn down and then use them as bedding. This constant exposure to the cold and discomfort was designed to toughen their skin and accustom their bodies to the extremes of whether they would face on campaign, where comfort would be non-existent. This intense physical and psychological conditioning, forcing them to live on the knife edge of survival, inevitably breeds a certain contempt for the softer, more luxurious ways of the non-Spartan Greeks. The Spartan views the Athenian with his fine food and padded clothes as utterly compromised a man whose physical weakness mirrors his moral and political weakness. The humor here lies in the Spartans' deeply conservative suspicion of technology or invention. Why invent a better blanket when the cold itself is your best teacher? This entire stage of the Aggie is deeply linked to the political necessity of the Spartan state. The constant need for stealth and the ability to live off the land have an internal purpose that is far darker than simply preparing for war with Athens. The Spartan soldier must be hard, cunning, and accustomed to operating in darkness because his greatest enemy is not across the border, but within the border. The massive, restive Helot population. The training in stealth and ruthlessness is, quite literally, preparation for the suppression of a perpetually looming internal revolt. This essential link between training and internal control leads us to the open question or debate. Historians still wonder about the exact extent to which the Aggie was successful in creating genuine ideological belief in the Spartan system, versus simply creating a generation of highly disciplined, psychologically repressed young men who were too terrified of internal punishment to rebel. Was their bravery a product of conviction, or simply a trained indifference to death? The answer, perhaps, lies in the next phase, where the organized brutality is given structure, and the older boys are formally empowered to become the enforcers of the system. The Spartan youth, hardened by hunger and disciplined by the whip, now advances into the next crucial stage of the Aggie. This is the moment when the power structure of the barracks shifts, and the older boys are formally integrated as instruments of state authority, ensuring that the system is perpetuated and enforced from within. This is the stage of the Iron, plural, Arenes, a title usually applied to the 16 to 19-year-olds who graduate from being Meliorine's younger teens and assume command of the younger packs. The Iron is not merely a senior student. He is an appointed sub-commander and mentor, vested with formal disciplinary power over the younger paids. He is the most immediate face of the Spartan state to the 7-year-old. His role is to lead the pack age all, organize their drills and exercises, and, critically, ensure absolute adherence to the unwritten rules of the training. His authority is nearly absolute, and any failure of the younger boys under his command reflects directly and harshly upon the Iron himself. This system of structured violence, where teenagers police and train preteens, is a genius piece of institutional design. It achieves several strategic goals simultaneously. It maintains strict discipline without requiring a massive, permanent staff of adult overseers. It provides the Iron with practical experience in command, management, and the brutal exercise of authority, and it conditions the younger boys to obey their immediate superiors without question, even if those superiors are barely older than they are. The widely accepted historical fact concerning the Iron is their role in initiating and overseeing the contests of dominance among the younger boys. These were not casual fights, but structured conflicts, often fueled by deliberate provocation or disputes over supplies, designed to test courage, physical skill, and the capacity for ruthless action. The Iron observed these interactions closely, using them as a perpetual screening process to identify future leaders and weed out those deemed too soft or weak. Violence among the boys was not incidental. It was a controlled, essential component of the curriculum. Furthermore, the Iron often served as a mentor in the truest sense, teaching the boys not only physical skills but also the essentials of the Spartan code. The capacity for silence, the importance of concise laconic communication, and the recitation of Homeric poems and war songs. The limited Spartan education in arts was entirely utilitarian, focused on instilling martial values and collective identity. The lesser known or fascinating detail revolves around the practice of the Iron bringing the boys into his personal service. The younger boys were expected to perform tasks for their Iron, sometimes carrying his simple belongings or assisting him. This proximity created intense bonds of loyalty and affection, sometimes described by classical writers as a formal, institutionalized relationship. This allowed the Iron to transmit the Spartan ideology and its specific values on an intimate, personal level, reinforcing state loyalty through a deeply emotional and hierarchical attachment. These bonds effectively replaced the familial attachments the agoge had systematically severed. The entire structure, centered on the delegation of harsh authority to the Iron, forces the boys to accept the hierarchy as a natural, unchallengeable part of their existence. It is here that the system exhibits a dark, elegant efficiency. The very ones who suffered under the system are now its enforcers, guaranteeing that the cycle of severity is never broken. The humor, if one can find it, lies in the intense seriousness with which these teenagers approach their immense, lethal responsibilities. Shuchi. Your old Iron held more practical life and death power than many elected officials in a democratic state like Athens. This internal, self-perpetuating system of control leads directly into the preparation for the ultimate state necessity, bringing us to the open question or debate. Historians still wonder about the precise legal accountability of the Iron for their disciplinary actions, especially in cases of extreme corporal punishment or death resulting from the intentional hardship. Were they held accountable by the adult paid nomos overseer only if their actions undermined state order? Or was their delegated authority truly absolute in the moment of discipline? The Spartan system, though seemingly transparent in its brutality, often obscured the legal line between permitted training and excessive cruelty. Largely because the state valued the outcome the disciplined soldiered above the safety of the individual trainee. The Iron is the final polishing agent on the young weapon, refining the skills of stealth, endurance, and ruthlessness until they are instinctive. Now, these skills are about to be put to their first, terrifying, and deeply political use. While the central pillars of the agoge are physical hardship, obedience, and endurance, the Spartan system was not entirely devoid of intellectual or artistic instruction. It is a widely accepted historical fact that Spartan boys received a form of education and subjects beyond the purely martial, though this education was severely limited and entirely utilitarian. This was the Spartan attempt to cultivate the mind, but only insofar as the mind served the shield. The young men were taught literacy, the ability to read and write, but only to a rudimentary degree. They needed to be able to read short, concise communications from their commanders, and perhaps to write simple, direct dispatches during campaign. This instruction focused purely on practical necessity. There was no study of complex literature or philosophical texts for their own sake. When Plutarch remarked that Spartan youth learned only enough to serve their needs, he captured the essence of their intellectual practicality. They were educated to be efficient cogs in the military machine, not wide-ranging scholars. The true intellectual focus lay in the mastery of laconic wit. The boys were trained to speak briefly, forcefully, and without superfluous words. Their responses were expected to be precise, witty, and immediately relevant to the topic at hand. Any youth who spoke too much, or whose speech was rambling and poorly structured, would be subject to immediate disciplinary action. This was more than just a preference for brevity. It was a military doctrine. In the chaos of the phalanx, communication must be instantaneous and unambiguous. The ability to condense complex ideas or commands into a few pointed words was a mark of superior training, and it created the famous, dry, often brutal humor for which the Spartans became known throughout Greece. Consider the role of music and poetry. This may seem counterintuitive in a barracks environment, but it was fundamental to the Spartan collective identity. They were taught to sing and play the lyre, but the songs were almost exclusively marching rhythms, war hymns, and odes to courage in previous Spartan glories. The content was deeply political and martial, designed to inspire bravery, maintain cohesion during battle maneuvers, and reinforce the values of self-sacrifice and state loyalty. Music, therefore, was not art for art's sake. It was a powerful piece of psychological warfare and social conditioning, ensuring that every beat and every lyric reinforced the necessary collective mindset. The lesser known or fascinating detail is the use of educational public spectacles. Plutarch notes that the arenas, and even the adult Spartans, would sometimes present boys with questions designed to challenge their moral reasoning or wit in front of the older citizens. For example, a boy might be asked, "Who is the most valiant man in the state?" Or "What is a good citizen?" The question was less important than the answer's delivery. It had to be quick, well-reasoned, and expressed with perfect, laconic brevity. If the answer was deemed slow or foolish, the iron in charge would bite the boy's thumb. An immediate and sharp physical penalty for intellectual slack. This blend of minimal literacy, martial music, and enforced rhetoric highlights a chilling paradox. The irony of the system. Sparta was deeply suspicious of intellectual curiosity, believing it led to innovation, dissent, and a questioning of the established order. Their education was a careful exercise in limiting knowledge, only granting enough instruction to make the soldier functionally effective, while deliberately withholding the tools for true critical thought that might lead to internal challenge. They wanted perfect obedience, not independent genius. This strategic limitation of the intellectual world brings us to the open question or debate. Historians still wonder if the intentional neglect of broad, critical intellectual education, the kind that fueled Athenian political theory and philosophical inquiry, was the ultimate structural reason for Sparta's eventual decline. Did their hyper-focus on military perfection leave them intellectually ill-equipped to adapt to changing economic and political realities in the wider Greek world, turning them into a powerful but ultimately rigid and brittle state? The Spartan youth now possesses the physical toughness of a survivalist, the tactical cunning of a thief, and the intellectual rigidity of a machine. He is ready for the final, terrible step of his conditioning, the dark initiation that reveals the true existential threat that underpins the entire Spartan system. The Spartan youth, having survived the scrutiny of the elders, the separation from his family, the relentless hunger, and the harsh discipline of the iron, now approaches the most sinister and defining ritual of his training. The Cryptia. Cryptia meaning the secret thing. This is not merely a test of physical endurance. It is a profound, violent rite of passage that unveils the dark, necessary engine of the entire Spartan state. The Cryptia was an institution shrouded in secrecy and fear, designed to serve two functions simultaneously: to provide the final, terrifying practical training for the most promising young men, and far more critically to maintain absolute crushing terror over the massive, subjugated population known as the helots. The helots were the enslaved inhabitants of Laconia and Messenia, tied to the land, who vastly outnumbered the Spartan citizens perhaps by a ratio of 10 or 15 to 1. The whole Spartan social structure, military discipline, and rigid lifestyle existed solely to keep this enormous, restive population from rising up and annihilating their masters. The helots were the constant, silent threat lurking beneath the surface of Spartan perfection. The widely accepted historical fact is the chilling purpose of the cryptia. Selected young men, having reached their late teens, were covertly sent out into the Laconian countryside armed only with a dagger and minimal supplies. Their mission was to spy on the helots, observe their movements, and, most importantly, eliminate any helot deemed too strong, too outspoken, or too potentially rebellious. This was not organized warfare. It was targeted political assassination carried out under the cover of darkness. These young men, the secret police of the Spartan state, had to operate in total stealth, living off the land, relying entirely on the cunning and ruthlessness they had perfected during their years of mandated hunger and theft in the agoge. They were hunters, and the human population they hunted was their state's economic foundation. They would move silently through the night, appearing suddenly to strike down leaders, disrupt gatherings, or simply execute individuals whose physical strength or intellectual bearing seemed dangerous to the stability of Sparta. The act itself was state-sanctioned and performed without legal consequence. Plutarch records a particularly chilling detail. Every year, the magistrates, the ephors, would formally declare war on the helot population. This cynical, administrative act of declaring war before the cryptia commenced served a horrific legal function. It allowed the young men to kill the helots without technically incurring the religious guilt, miasma, associated with murder. The killing was thus not a crime, but a legal act of warfare executed against an internal enemy. This bureaucratic maneuver is the ultimate expression of the Spartan state's cold, absolute control over justice and morality. The lesser known, or fascinating detail, concerns the sheer psychological impact of the cryptia on both the perpetrators and the victims. For the young Spartan, it was the final, profound lesson. The complete eradication of any residual human compassion. He learned that the lives of the non-citizens were utterly disposable in service to the collective. He was forced to perform the ultimate act of ruthlessness alone, in the dark, cementing the understanding that his loyalty lay solely with the state and its survival. For the helots, the cryptia meant that terror was a constant, unpredictable force. They never knew when or where the silent predator would strike, ensuring that they were held in a state of perpetual, decentralized dread. The absence of organized rebellion over centuries is the dark testament to the effectiveness of this random, terrifying policy. The cryptia also served a practical selection purpose. Only the most resourceful, stealthy, and mentally hardened young men were chosen for this duty. Those who completed it successfully demonstrated they possessed the two non-negotiable qualities of a full citizen: absolute obedience to the state's most terrible commands, and the tactical capacity to execute those commands flawlessly. The experience, by forcing them to cross the moral Rubicon into cold-blooded killing, bound them to the system with a chain of shared, unforgivable political violence. There is a grim irony in this entire structure. The Spartans famously boasted about their system's ability to produce the bravest soldiers on the battlefield, men who faced death without flinching. Yet, the entire system, the hunger, the stealth training, and the cryptia was fundamentally designed not for external conquest, but for internal security. Sparta was a state perpetually locked in a state of civil war with its own laborers. Their entire brilliant military machine was, at its core, a gigantic apparatus for guarding a slave plantation. Their legendary discipline was merely the fear of the helots turned inward. This necessary, terrifying engine of the Spartan state leads us to the open question or debate. Historians still wonder about the frequency and scale of the cryptia. Was it a rare symbolic art, carried out by a few elite youths to maintain a myth of terror? Or was it a continuous, organized campaign of systematic surveillance and liquidation practiced widely across the territory? The limited and often hostile nature of the surviving sources makes it difficult to establish the exact number of participants or victims, leaving its precise function somewhere between a rite of passage and a standing death squad. With his dark initiation complete, the young Spartan man is now fully forged. He is a certified hunter and executioner. Yet, the Spartan system is incomplete without acknowledging the other half of the population, the women whose training was just as rigorous and just as essential to the state's survival, but aimed at a different, crucial purpose, with the men's training culminating in the secretive terror of the Cryptia. The narrative must now turn to the Spartan female. The system of state control and rigorous physical conditioning was not exclusive to the boys. It extended, with equal intensity, to the girls. However, their training was engineered for a different, though equally vital, function. The creation of strong, fit mothers capable of bearing robust warriors. The Spartan woman's body was viewed as a state-controlled resource, a breeding ground for the next generation of perfect soldiers. Unlike women in virtually every other Greek city-state who were confined to the home, veiled, and primarily responsible for weaving and managing the household, Spartan women enjoyed an astonishing degree of physical freedom and public visibility. This freedom, though, came with a specific, mandated purpose. They were expected to be athletic, tough, and mentally resilient, qualities deemed essential for producing and rearing strong offspring who would not fail the scrutiny of the elders. The widely accepted historical fact is the existence of state-mandated physical education for Spartan girls. Their curriculum included running, wrestling, discus throwing, and javelin practice. They competed in their own festivals and games, often performing in public, sometimes wearing minimal clothing like a short tunic, the peplus, which split down the side, earning them the nickname Theshahus from other Greeks who were scandalized by their display. This physical training was designed to prepare them for the rigors of childbirth, which was considered the ultimate service to the state for a woman. If a man's highest honor was to die bravely in the phalanx, a woman's highest honor was to produce a son who could do the same. This is summarized in the famous laconic saying attributed to a Spartan mother, who, handing her son his shield as he marched to war, famously commanded Aton, Epitas, come back with his shield, or on it. The education of girls also included music, poetry, and dance. But similar to the boys' training, these arts were highly martial and geared toward state loyalty. The poetry they learned focused on celebrating the city's heroes and the virtues of courage and obedience. Their training instilled a deep, almost fanatical pride in Sparta, creating women who were psychologically prepared to sacrifice their husbands and sons to the state as welfare without complaint. The lesser known of fascinating detail is the immense degree of economic independence Spartan women possessed. Because the men lived permanently in the barracks of Sisha and were strictly forbidden from engaging in trade, Spartan women could inherit, own, and manage property and land. By the classical period, some estimates suggest that Spartan women controlled up to 40% of all Laconian land. This unusual economic power was a direct, albeit unintended, consequence of the rigid military system that required men to be permanently detached from the civilian economy. This makes Sparta an anomaly in the ancient world, a society highly restrictive of its men's individual freedom, which inadvertently granted its women remarkable economic agency. The irony is palpable. The most militarily rigid state in Greece created a class of independently wealthy female landowners. Their role also extended to actively shaming men who displayed cowardice. Spartan women were famously ruthless in their condemnation of men who abandoned their duty or survived a battle disgracefully losing one's shield. Was the ultimate disgrace. They were the cultural enforcers of the state's martial code on the home front, ensuring that social pressure remained intense, even when the men were not in the barracks. The entire system of female education and autonomy leads us to the open question or debate. Historians still wonder if the significant land ownership by Spartan women eventually contributed to the state's decline. As property accumulated in the hands of fewer and fewer wealthy families, often women controlling, the wealth had created severe economic inequality among the male citizens, eventually shrinking the pool of men who could afford to contribute to the mandatory communal messes, and thus qualify as full-status citizens. Did the women's legal power granted initially for the sake of healthy breeding, ultimately undermined the economic foundation of the military class. The final element of the Spartan citizen's life, both male and female, is the understanding that individual success and wealth must be dissolved into the collective. For the men, this meant the mandatory communal barracks, a lifelong commitment that ensured the continued cohesion of the warrior class. The journey of the Spartan man, marked by selection, separation, and secret violence, finds its permanent, defining resting place not on the battlefield, but in the psyche, the mandatory communal mess halls. This institution was the ultimate expression of the Spartan ideal of absolute equality and collective unity, designed to supersede the family, reject the corrosive influence of wealth, and ensure the constant military readiness of the ruling class. Membership in a secession was not optional. It was the widely accepted historical fact that it was the non-negotiable requirement for full Spartan citizenship, the essential right that confirmed a man as one of the homoioi, the equals. A Spartan man, even after marrying, did not live with his wife. He slept and ate every single day of his life with his fellow soldiers in the communal mess hall. The family home was primarily for the women and children. The man's true residence was the psyche. Think of it not merely as a cafeteria, but as a permanent military club, a daily parliament, and a lifelong extension of the training barracks. Each Sicilian consisted of about 15 men, drawn from different age groups, to maintain the crucial mentorship and hierarchical structure established in the age. The oldest members, veterans of campaigns and the system, sat alongside the younger men, who were expected to learn, listen, and remain silent unless spoken to. The atmosphere was one of intense, enforced sobriety and seriousness. Humor, if present, was the dry, biting, laconic wit we discussed earlier, usually directed at shaming a man for a minor slip in discipline or courage. The most critical function of the secession was the rejection of ostentatious wealth. The meals were simple, standardized, and notoriously frugal, centered around the infamous melazimos, black broth. Every man, regardless of his personal wealth or landholdings, ate the exact same food as his neighbor. This was a deliberate political and ideological choice. By standardizing diet and communal living, Sparta attempted to eliminate the visible markers of rich and poor among the citizens. All men were equal in poverty and discipline within the four walls of the mess hall. This uniformity required a mandatory contribution from every full citizen. Each man was required to provide a monthly quota of barley, wine, cheese, figs, and a small amount of currency to support the mess. This contribution was critical. If a Spartan citizen, due to economic hardship, could not provide his share, he instantly forfeited his full citizenship status and became one of the disenfranchised, the hypomiones, inferior. This rule was the ultimate tool for maintaining the homogeneity of the warrior class, and exerted immense pressure on every Spartan to retain his land and wealth sufficient to meet this contribution, even though he could not openly flaunt that wealth. The lesser-known or fascinating detail is the use of the psyche for political and judicial observation. These dinners were not silent affairs. They were places of constant conversation and debate, primarily focused on state affairs, military strategy, and the behavior of citizens. Because the men lived and ate under constant scrutiny, the psyche acted as a powerful, informal court of public opinion. A man's reputation, his honesty, and his courage were constantly under review by his peers. Any deviation from the rigid Spartan moral code would immediately be noticed, discussed, and potentially brought to the attention of the F4s, the 5 elected magistrates, ensuring a pervasive social control that supplemented the formal legal system. You could not hide your character or your shame in Sparta. Furthermore, the psyche was central to the process of replacing the family bond. By making a man's entire social and political life revolve around his messmates, the state successfully shifted his primary loyalty from his blood kin to his military collective. These were the men he trained with, ate with, judged with, and would ultimately fight and die with. The intimacy, forged by this lifelong proximity and shared commitment, superseded the domestic sphere entirely. The Spartan man's life was a study in paradox. He was constantly struggling to maintain enough private wealth, usually land and helots, to meet the mandatory public contribution, yet he was simultaneously forbidden from enjoying or displaying that wealth. He was an individual landowner whose entire identity was predicated on his membership in a socialist-like military collective. This constant tension between private economic necessity and public egalitarian performance became a silent, internal strain on the system. It is ironically humorous that a system designed to eliminate the influence of gold was ultimately destroyed by the need for enough grain and wine to maintain the social status of its citizens. This entire institutional design was a direct response to the existential threat of the hell. The secession ensured that the entire Spartan male citizen body was always physically close, constantly monitored, and always ready to mobilize instantly as a cohesive fighting unit at the first sign of an internal uprising. Their rigid discipline and unbreakable bonds were a direct result of the perpetual fear that lay just outside their city walls. This deeply rooted institution leads us to the open question or debate historians still wonder about: the degree to which the rules of the Syssitia were actually observed in later periods of Spartan history, particularly after major victories began to expose Spartans to foreign wealth and luxury. Did the introduction of coinage and the increasing wealth disparity among citizens lead to an decay of the communal strict egalitarianism? Or was the psychological adherence to the ideal strong enough to resist the erosion of economic reality? For generations, the success of the agoge and the cohesion of the Syssitia culminate in the final, most crucial step for the young Spartan: the transition from trainee to full citizen, a moment fraught with its own unique perils. The relentless training of the agoge is designed to produce a homoiouson equal, a full Spartan citizen. But the journey does not end with the successful completion of the training period around the age of 20. That milestone only marks the beginning of the final, precarious hurdle: the transition from state ward to full member of the political collective. This moment, fraught with social peril, determines whether the trained youth will become a pillar of the state or be cast out into political darkness. The widely accepted historical fact is that the final act of graduation was not a formal ceremony or an academic examination, but the successful election of the young man into a pre-existing secession communal mess hall. The 20-year-old, having proven his martial worth and obedience throughout the rigorous training, was required to petition one of the communal messes for membership. This was a secret ballot conducted by the existing members, and it was the ultimate test of his social acceptance. The voting process itself was famously austere and decisive. As described by Plutarch, the members of the Syssitia would cast their votes by placing a piece of dough, or sometimes a crumb of bread, into a basin carried by an attendant. If the dough was flattened or pressed, it signified a vote of acceptance. If the piece of dough was kept whole, it was a negative vote. The decision had to be unanimous. A single, solitary negative vote, even if cast by the least influential member, was enough to reject the young man entirely. This process underscores the absolute premium Sparta placed on cohesion and group acceptance. The collective had to approve the individual without reservation. If he was accepted, the young man achieved the status of full citizenship, was now one of the homo, and began his mandatory lifelong commitment to eating and living in the mess hall. His training was deemed complete. His loyalty was confirmed. He was a perfect member of the most elite military club in the ancient world. However, the rejection was devastating. If the youth was rejected, a fate possible for even the most physically adept former trainee, he was instantly denied full citizenship. He became one of the hypomyons, or inferiors, a class of disenfranchised men who were still technically free Spartans, but lacked the political rights, social standing, and military role of the homoioi. This was the great shame, the ultimate failure of the agoge. The reasons for rejection were rarely based on physical prowess, which had been vetted years earlier. Rejection was usually based on character flaws observed throughout his years of training: cowardice, lack of cooperation, insufficient laconic wit, or perhaps, most commonly, an inability to meet the mandatory financial contribution to the mess. The rise of economic inequality, fueled by land concentration and the growing difficulty of maintaining one's helot population, meant that some young men, despite passing every test, simply could not afford the prerequisite to citizenship. The lesonon A fascinating detail is the immense social pressure faced by the hypomia. They lived under a cloud of deep humiliation. They were subject to various forms of public disgrace. Plutarch records that they could not sit in the presence of the homoioi, and were generally shunned and ridiculed. They were men without honor in a state built on honor, often becoming marginalized figures forced into occupations deemed unsuitable for full citizens, like trade or manual labor, ironically engaging in the very activities the homoioi disdained. Their existence served as a chilling, daily reminder to every young man of the catastrophic cost of failure. This ruthless sorting mechanism forces us to look beyond the military perfection and see the system's profound political rigidity. The Spartan citizenship pool was famously small, constantly threatened by military losses, and now further restricted by the twin pressures of peer review and economic requirements. The state's obsession with perfection and absolute homogeneity meant that it willingly sidelined highly trained soldiers simply because they failed a political or economic test, weakening its own ranks. This intense focus on internal purity and cohesion brings us to the open question or debate. Historians still wonder about the long-term political impact of the hypomaions. Did this class of disenfranchised, well-trained, and deeply resentful men eventually become a source of internal destabilization for the Spartan state? Their military skill meant they were dangerous outsiders, and their existence demonstrated a profound structural flaw in a system that claimed to be the rule of the equals. The successful graduate now has his seat in the mess hall and his place in the phalanx, but the absolute discipline and the entire structure of his life is founded on a single, silent necessity: the constant subjugation of the immense population that tills the fields and funds the very broth he now eats. This shadow of the oppressed is what must now be brought fully into the light. The entire structure of Spartan life, from the cradle to the communal mess hall, is built upon a profound and terrifying paradox. The Spartan citizen, the legendary homoios, the equal, is the most disciplined and free man in the Greek world. Yet his freedom is utterly dependent on the complete, brutal subjugation of another Greek population. The entire Spartan system, in its discipline, its training, and its unique politics, is an apparatus designed not primarily for conquest abroad, but for constant internal suppression. This shadow of the oppressed is the deepest, darkest truth of the Spartan state. The helots were the inhabitants of the territories conquered by Sparta, primarily Laconia and Messenia. Unlike chattel slaves who were privately owned and could be bought and sold individually, the helots were the property of the Spartan state. They were serfs, bound to the land they worked, which was divided into estates and allotted to individual Spartan citizens. Their function was singular and indispensable: to till the land and yield the produce that entirely supported the Spartan citizens, freeing them to pursue their lifelong profession of warfare. This economic arrangement is the widely accepted historical fact that powered the Spartan military miracle. The helots were, quite literally, the economic foundation of the hoplites' existence. The sheer scale of this subjugation is staggering. Conservative estimates suggest that the helots outnumbered the Spartan citizens by a margin of at least 7, and likely much higher, perhaps 10 or even 15 to 1 during periods of prosperity. This demographic reality created a state of perpetual, existential fear among the Spartans. They understood that a unified helot revolt would instantly obliterate their elite class. Every military exercise, every law, and every act of brutality must be viewed through this lens of constant, crippling anxiety. The daily life of the Spartan male, spent in the barracks and constantly drilling, was a direct, necessary response to this threat. The rule of the Psyche requiring the homoioi to be constantly gathered together and ready to mobilize was essentially a permanent, rapid response garrison duty. If the helots rose up, the Spartans needed to be able to form a phalanx within minutes. They were soldiers living in an armed camp that was perpetually under siege from within. The military training of the agoge, particularly the emphasis on stealth, survival, and ruthlessness, was fundamentally geared towards policing this massive internal population. The boys learned to steal and operate in the darkness not just for foreign campaigns, but to monitor and control the countryside settlements where the helots lived. The most chilling example of this preparation, as explored in the previous section, was the Cryptiatha secret operation where elite young Spartans were sent out to murder politically active or overly robust helots. This was the mechanism for decapitating potential revolt leaders and maintaining an atmosphere of pervasive, unpredictable terror. The state's cruelty toward the helots was institutionalized in public. Thucydides records a particularly grim incident where the Spartans, after a period of helot bravery during a war, offered freedom to 2,000 of the most deserving helots. When the 2,000 were selected and marched around the temples in celebration, they mysteriously vanished, presumed to have been murdered by the Spartans to eliminate the strongest and most ambitious individuals. This was a calculated, political purging designed to keep the remaining helots docile. The lesser-known, or fascinating detail is the strange semi-autonomy the helots retained in their daily labor. Because they were state property bound to the land, they were not managed on a daily basis by the individual Spartan citizen. They paid a fixed, often large, quota apophora of their produce to the citizen, and theoretically retained the surplus. This meant that they lived in their own villages, maintained their own traditions, and were often allowed to manage their own small internal affairs, as long as the mandatory payment was met and they did not rebel. This tiny, structural latitude allowed the helot identity and culture to survive for centuries, despite the oppression, and provided them with some collective memory and the occasional opportunity to coordinate resistance, which in turn kept the Spartan fear perpetually sharp. This deep reliance on and fear of the helots dictated Sparta's entire foreign policy. The Spartans were famously reluctant to engage in long foreign campaigns. They were hesitant to deploy their highly limited citizen army too far or for too long, knowing that the helots might use the opportunity of their absence to rise up. This internal liability made them an often isolationist and unpredictable ally on the Greek stage. Their focus was almost always on maintaining control of the Peloponnese, the region where their own serfs resided. The fear of domestic insurgency was a far stronger governor of Spartan policy than the desire for foreign empire. The irony is inescapable. The greatest military power in Greece was ironically crippled by its own economic system. The helots, though suppressed, were not passive victims. The history of Sparta is punctuated by significant revolts, most notably the massive Third Messenian War in the mid-5th century BC, triggered by a great earthquake that devastated the city of Sparta itself. The helots saw the destruction as divine intervention and seized the chance to fight a long, brutal war for independence. This revolt shook the foundations of the state and forced Sparta to seek help from its bitter rival, Athens, illustrating the severity of the internal crisis. This ever-present shadow leads us to the open question or debate. Historians still wonder about the extent of the helot contribution to the Spartan military itself. While the homoioi were the hoplites, the helots often served as light-armed troops, siloi, and even occasionally as freed Neodamedea's new citizens after performing brave service. Did the helots' participation in battle, fighting alongside their masters, serve to slightly reduce the internal tension by offering a path to freedom, or did it simply grant a highly organized armed mass of discontented people valuable military training and experience they could later turn against their oppressors? The entire architecture of the Spartan system, its discipline, its ruthlessness, and its singular focus, was a cage built not just for its citizens, but for the vast, restless population that lay beneath them. This state of constant, manufactured tension required a powerful myth to legitimize the extreme rigidity and perpetual cruelty of the system. That myth rested upon the figure of the legendary Log of Erlich. To enforce a system as brutal, rigid, and enduring as the Spartan military state, relying solely on fear and physical force, is insufficient. It requires the power of myth and ideological legitimacy. That legitimacy was found in the legendary figure of Lycurgus, the ancient lawgiver, to whom the Spartans attributed every single aspect of their unique constitution and way of life. The widely accepted historical fact is that Lycurgus is a figure of legend, not historical certainty. Historians and classical writers, even in antiquity, debated whether he was a real person, a composite of several reformers, or simply a fictional idealization. Regardless of his existence, his importance lies in his function. He provided the perfect, unchallengeable origin story for the Spartan system. The Spartans claimed that, Lycurgus, guided by the Oracle of Delphi, established the entire framework of their laws. The rethra, pronounced rintra, in one single, ancient stroke of genius. This myth of a single all-encompassing lawgiver was vital because it allowed the Spartans to portray their society not as a dynamic political evolution subject to human debate and change, but as a perfect, timeless, and divinely sanctioned creation. If Lycurgus created the perfect system in the deep past, then any subsequent attempt to alter the rules. Boagi, the Syssitia, the ban on gold currency, or the subjugation of the Helotzois, not merely political disagreement, but a sacrilegious attack on the state's very foundation. The laws themselves, the retra, were believed to be deliberately simple and unwritten, emphasizing their sanctity and permanence. The fundamental rule of the retra was the absolute subordination of the individual to the state. It mandated the equal distribution of land among the citizens, at least initially, the communal mess holes, the AGI, and the restrictions on private wealth. Lycurgus was credited with engineering a society designed to eliminate the two great threats to stability: luxurious, soft living leading to physical decay, and economic inequality leading to political dissent. The lesser known or fascinating detail is the legendary story of Lycurgus's own death, which perfectly sealed the unchangeable nature of his laws. After establishing the retra, the legend states that Lycurgus made the Spartan people swear an oath to maintain his laws exactly as they were until he returned from a journey. He then departed, but instead of returning, he starved himself to death in exile, ensuring that, since he technically could never return, the Spartans were eternally bound by their oath to his unchangeable laws. This macabre final act was the ultimate psychological insurance policy for the Spartan system, cementing its inherent resistance to innovation. This rigid adherence to the supposed ancient laws meant that the Spartans viewed their system as complete and superior to all others. They were deeply suspicious of foreign influence of new ideas, new people, and new technology, fearing that exposure would contaminate the purity of Lycurgus's perfect creation. They rarely traveled abroad for pleasure, and foreigners were often viewed with suspicion and occasionally expelled in periods of anxieties. The humor, in a historical sense, lies in the intense irony. The Spartans, who produced arguably the greatest military political system of their time, were intellectually stifled by their own founding myth. They intentionally rejected the very forces of change and intellectual curiosity that allowed their rival, Athens, to flourish in philosophy, art, and democratic thought. They were stuck in a self-imposed political amber, perfectly preserved, but unable to adapt. This ideological entrenchment brings us back to the open question or debate. Historians still wonder about the specific reforms that were later retroactively attributed to Lycurgus. Given that the Spartan system likely evolved over centuries through various political struggles and compromises, at what point did the legendary figure become a convenient political tool to halt all future debate about economic and social change? Was Lycurgus an invention of the 6th century BCE to solidify the power of the landowning elite against populist movements? The myth itself is perhaps more real, and certainly more powerful, than the man it purports to describe. The retra and the myth of Lycurgus were the essential, invisible walls around the Spartan state, protecting it from internal deviation and external influence. This deep conservatism, however, was not without its consequences, particularly in the economic realm, where their fear of change manifested in a physical, palpable way. The Spartan adherence to the myth of Lycurgus created a society deliberately frozen in time. Their fear of political and social change manifested powerfully in their economic practices, most notably in their rejection of the sophisticated currency and trade systems that flourished elsewhere in the Greek world. This profound conservatism was not just a cultural quirk. It was a deliberate state policy designed to eliminate the two great catalysts of change: personal enrichment and foreign influence. The widely accepted historical fact that illustrates this fear is the Spartan use of iron currency instead of gold or silver coinage. Lycurgus, according to legend, commanded that all gold and silver currency be abolished, replacing it with a clumsy, heavy, and low-value currency made of iron, often in the form of large bars or spits, known as pellets. These iron bars were purposefully quenched in vinegar to make them brittle, worthless for any other purpose than internal exchange, and too cumbersome to be transported in significant amounts. Imagine trying to buy a common slave or a fine vase with these bars in Athens or Corinth. It would require a wagon. The sheer impracticality of this currency served its purpose brilliantly. It made external trade and the accumulation of individual wealth almost impossible for the homoia. If a Spartan general somehow acquired gold or silver loot on campaign, he could not easily use it or store it in Sparta without attracting immediate suspicion and severe punishment. The system forced the Spartan citizen to rely entirely on the state-managed, redistributional economy supported by the Hellenes. This economic conservatism extended to their entire material culture. Spartan homes were simple, deliberately unadorned, and their pottery and artifacts were notoriously plain and functional. Compared to the artistic brilliance of the Athenians or Corinthians, luxury was not simply discouraged, it was considered a subversive threat to the military ethic. The focus was always on the essential: the bronze shield, the spear, and the communal meal. Everything else was a dangerous distraction. The lesser known, or fascinating detail is the practice of xenolasia, expulsion of foreigners. While not continuous, the Spartans periodically expelled foreigners from their territory, especially during times of political anxiety or crisis. This was a physical manifestation of their paranoia regarding foreign influence. They feared that travelers, merchants, or even visiting dignitaries would bring with them not just new goods, but dangerous new ideas, philosophical concepts, political theories, or novel artistic pursuits that might lead citizens to question the perfection of lycurgus. They were attempting to maintain a sort of cultural quarantine around their society. This rigidity had profound consequences. While it initially ensured remarkable stability and military focus, it also condemned Sparta to economic and political stagnation. Their lack of engagement with the vibrant, innovative currents of the wider Greek world meant they missed out on advances in siege warfare, naval technology until necessity forced them to change, and administrative finance. They were a one-trick pony, brilliant at producing the hoplite phalanx, but deeply inflexible when circumstances demanded a different approach. The humor here is rooted in the tragic irony. The Spartans' ultimate failure was an administrative failure. A state that invented one of the most rigorously organized training systems in history could not manage to evolve its own civil structure or economy. They refused to adopt the more efficient political tools like a modern currency or a complex diplomatic structure that would have allowed their great power to be projected effectively and sustained over time. They won the battles, but were ill-equipped to win the resulting peace. This inherent weakness brings us to the open question or debate. Historians still wonder if the failure to adapt was entirely due to ideological conservatism, or if the necessity of Hellid control was the true, paralyzing factor. Could Sparta afford to engage in extensive trade or foreign interaction, which would inevitably require sending large numbers of citizens away and exposing their highly controlled system to external scrutiny and subversive ideas? Was their stagnation a choice for purity, or a necessary side effect of managing a vast slave population? The result of this economic and ideological rigidity was the creation of the finest individual soldier the ancient world had ever seen, yet one whose very success was chained by the limits of his state's inflexible system. We now turn to the ultimate irony: how this very perfection ultimately restricted their imperial power. The Spartan system, culminating in the Homoios, the perfect soldier, represented the pinnacle of human martial engineering. Yet, the same rigid adherence to the principles of Lycurgus that created this perfection also imposed a profound and crippling limit on Sparta's capacity for sustained imperial power. The irony is that the state designed to produce the most formidable army ultimately found its own success constrained by its inflexibility and its internal fears. The widely accepted historical fact regarding the Spartan army is its unparalleled reputation as the most effective heavy infantry hoplites in Greece. Their training, which began in childhood, produced men who were masters of drill, discipline, and absolute cohesion in the phalanx formation. When Spartan hoplites were on the field, the morale of their enemies often broke before the actual clash. Their success was based on their ability to act not as individuals, but as a single, unbreakable bronze wall. They were, tactically, flawless. However, this very specialization became a severe liability. Sparta was a one-dimensional military power. They mastered the land war, but they initially lacked the naval capacity required for control of the Aegean Sea. More critically, their rigid social structure meant they could not easily replenish their losses. Their citizenship pool homoioi was exceptionally small, a result of the selective agoge, the economic bar of the Sycesia contribution, and the inherent casualties of constant warfare. Every time Sparta committed a large body of citizens to a major campaign, they risked suffering an irreparable loss. The famous defeat at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE, where the Thebans shattered the Spartan line, was so devastating precisely because the number of citizens lost represented a critical percentage of the total homoioi population. In contrast, rivals like Athens could suffer massive losses and still recover because their citizenship was not defined by such a restrictive, lifelong, military economic institution. This fear of a recoverable population loss constantly tempered Sparta's ambitions. The lesser known or fascinating detail is how this conservatism influenced their strategic thinking. Spartan generals were often notoriously cautious and predictable. Their decades of training instilled discipline and obedience, but they struggled to produce the kind of rapid, innovative tactical genius that marked leaders like the Athenian Themistocles or the Theban Epaminondas. They preferred the perfect execution of proven maneuvers over risky, creative strategy. Their entire psychological framework was designed to preserve the status quo of their state, which translated into a reluctance to embrace the bold, transformative campaigns necessary to forge a lasting empire. The perfect soldier was, ironically, too valuable to be risked for the sake of audacious conquest. Furthermore, the very laws designed to protect their purity made them terrible administrators of an empire. When Sparta achieved hegemony over Greece following the Peloponnesian War, they struggled to govern their newly acquired territories. Their system built on the principle of minimal government, military discipline, and the rejection of currency and trade was incapable of managing the complexities of collecting tribute, establishing effective garrisons, and maintaining diplomatic relations across a vast, disparity league. Their attempts at rule were characterized by imposition, harshness, and a simple replacement of democracy with narrow oligarchies, which quickly bred resentment and resistance. The irony here is deep and profound. The state that created the world's first professional, full-time soldier was the one least equipped to deal with the results of his success. They were brilliant at the destructive act of warfare, but inept at the constructive act of governance. They could defeat enemies, but they could not integrate or absorb them. This leads us to the open question, or debate. Historians still wonder if the ultimate irony of Sparta was the inherent contradiction between the principle of homoioi, the equals, and the rising reality of extreme wealth disparity among the citizens. As men gained spoils of war and land became concentrated in fewer hands, did the myth of equality rigidly enforced in the mess halls become so profoundly disconnected from the financial reality that the citizens quietly lost faith in the system even while adhering to its discipline? Was the perfect soldier fighting for a fiction? The answer lies in the slow, systemic dissolution of the state itself. The Spartan system, built to withstand foreign aggression, proved utterly vulnerable to the corrosive effects of time, economics, and demographic decay. The perfection of the individual soldier could not save the structural flaws of the state. The story of Sparta is not one of sudden, catastrophic destruction, but of a long, agonizing decline, a slow, systemic dissolution known to historians as the Long Fade. The ultimate irony is that the state designed for perpetual military perfection was simply worn down by the quiet, corrosive effects of time, economics, and demography, forces against which its perfect bronze shield was useless. The end of the Spartan Golden Age began not with one foreign invasion, but with a series of structural failures. The most devastating blow was the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE, led by Epaminondas, used a tactical innovation de oblique phalanx to crush the Spartan line. The military loss itself was severe, but the resulting political loss was fatal. Epaminondas marched into Messenia and liberated the Hellenes. This single act, the independence of the population that had funded and sustained the Spartan way of life for centuries, decapitated the Spartan economy and destroyed the very foundation of the homoioi class. This is the widely accepted historical fact, marking the point of no return for Spartan power. With the Messenian Helots free, The Spartan citizens could no longer rely on the vast, fixed quota of produce to fund their psyche contributions. The economic strain became immediately unbearable. The pool of full citizens, already shrinking due to battle losses and the rigorous qualifications of the now dropped precipitously. Men who could no longer afford the mandatory mess contribution were immediately stripped of their full rights and relegated to the status of hypomyons. This accelerated the crisis, leading to a vicious cycle. Fewer citizens meant a smaller army, which meant less control, which meant more economic instability, which meant fewer citizens. By the 3rd century BCE, the number of full Spartan citizens had dwindled, alarmingly potentially numbering only a few hundred men, leaving a large, aging military state to be defended by a tiny elite corps and a scattering of marginalized inferiors and freed helots. The entire structure, designed for perfect homogeneity, fractured into a society dominated by a handful of ultra-wealthy families, often female landowners, as previously discussed, and a vast number of disenfranchised free men. The principle of homoioi, the equals, became a cruel, historical joke. The state tried to resist this internal decay with desperate, reactionary measures. Kings like Aegis IV and Cleomenes III attempted radical land reforms in the 3rd century BC, attempting to redistribute wealth, cancel debts, and artificially replenish the citizen body by granting status to hypomyons. These efforts, while heroic in their intention to return Sparta to the mythical purity of life, were met with fierce resistance from the entrenched wealthy families and ultimately failed, often violently. The lesser known, or fascinating detail, is the quiet physical decline of the city itself. In contrast to Athens, which continued to thrive as a philosophical and cultural center well into the Roman era, the city of Sparta essentially became a backwater. The famous Wall of Sparta was always its men, not stone, but as the men dwindled, the city remained unfortified for centuries. It was only during the later Hellenistic period that the Spartans, in a final act of desperation, began to construct a proper defensive wall around the city. A tacit admission that the perfect system had failed, and their men could no longer guarantee their security alone. This late wall is the physical monument to the collapse of the Spartan ideal. The legacy of the agoge itself, once the envy of the Greek world, persisted only as a kind of historical tourist attraction. Under Roman rule, the Spartans were often allowed to maintain their peculiar customs. The diamastagosis, the ritualized whipping contest at the altar of Artemis Orthia, once a brutal test of pain tolerance for future soldiers, became a public spectacle for Roman visitors who came to gawk at the savage oddity of the Laconian culture. The warrior culture was reduced to a theatrical performance. The perfect soldier had become a museum piece. This slow, structural decay leads us to the open question or debate. Historians still wonder if the fatal flaw of the Spartan system was its inherent resistance to population growth. Did the deliberate control of marriage, often through arranged unions designed to produce fit offspring, the agoge's focus on a tiny elite, and the high rate of male mortality due to their lifelong profession combined to create a demographic trap from which the state could never escape? Was the system, in its relentless pursuit of quality, simply incapable of generating the quantity needed for long-term survival? The ultimate truth of Sparta is that discipline is not enough. The perfect military system, divorced from economic flexibility, political adaptability, and sufficient human capital, is destined to fade. The bronze shield was polished to perfection, but it could not defend against the economic erosion caused by the loss of the helots, nor the quiet indifference of the centuries. The system of Lycurgus, intended to be timeless, lasted only as long as the internal terror it propagated remained functional. When the helots were freed, the Spartans, ironically, became enslaved to the collapse of their own perfect order. We began this journey in the shadows, watching a state methodically dismantle the bonds of human affection to forge an instrument of war. We followed the Spartan boy from the cold judgment of the elders to the rigorous starvation of the packs, and finally to the terrifying, state-sanctioned violence of the cryptia. We saw how every aspect of life, food, education, women's status, and the economy was ruthlessly engineered to serve one primary goal: the maintenance of the military elite against the overwhelming existential threat of their own enslaved population, the Helots. The story of Sparta is a magnificent lesson in efficiency and irony. It was a triumph of human will, proving that, through absolute, unyielding discipline, a society could manufacture a soldier of peerless quality. Yet, that very dedication to perfection became its greatest weakness. By making military excellence the sole metric of worth, by suppressing intellectual curiosity, and by rejecting the essential mechanisms of trade and innovation, Sparta created a society that was powerful but brittle, brilliant but stagnant. They were prepared for every war but the final, necessary war against change itself. The echoes of the Spartan ideal are not found in modern armies, but in the enduring human temptation toward simplistic, centralized solutions. Whenever we prioritize ruthless efficiency over individual liberty, when we mistake discipline for true strength, or when we attempt to halt the chaotic, necessary flow of change, we are unconsciously echoing the retro of Sparta teaches us that while discipline can forge the sharpest weapon, it cannot sustain a civilization indefinitely. To endure, a society must be not only strong but adaptable, not only cohesive but creative. True survival is found not in the rigidity of bronze, but in the restless, evolving complexity of the human spirit.